Welcome to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I'm KM Weiland, and I am here to take you deep with story theory, writing techniques, and the incredible wisdom of story. I believe story is the greatest power on this earth, and that as writers, we carry the torch of wielding that power with responsibility, passion, and skill. There's no such thing as just a story. Today, it is my honor and my purpose to help you write your best story, astound the world, and maybe change your life. Hello and welcome. You are listening to Season 17, Episode 18 of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. In a world flooded with stories, books, shows, films, and endless social content, it's easy to fall into passive consumption. But as writers and creatives, what we take in matters just as much as what we put out. To be able to write with depth and clarity and resonance, we must first learn to read and watch more intentionally and with greater awareness. Intentional consumption isn't about being rigid or highbrow. Rather, it's about choosing stories that challenge us, feed us, and reflect the kind of storytelling we want, in turn, to create. Earlier this month, I offered an episode about why intentional storytelling matters in an era of AI and algorithm-driven content. It was an exploration of all the reasons intentional storytelling has always mattered, and perhaps matters more than ever in our modern era of ultra speed and convenient shortcuts. The first comment on that post on my website, amongst many in a wonderfully rich discussion, was from Heather J. Bennett, who wrote, "It's also a problem with lazy readers who aren't taking the time to slow down and read the story as it's written. Their attention spans for reading for the nuance of the storytelling is shorter, with understandable life priorities and needing to get things done." Now, this immediately spoke to something I was already thinking about, which is that intentional consumption, reading and watching, is just as important, if not more so, than intentional creation. However, this is not to separate writers from consumers or suggest others should bear the blame for bad stories being all too acceptable to the market. After all, we, as writers, are first and foremost members of that same audience. To the degree we seek to create intentional art that is on purpose and for a reason, then this is a reminder that our reading and watching choices not only inform the general market, but also the quality of what we're inputting into our own experiences and how that affects the output in our writing. So welcome to today's episode, 7 Ways to Watch and Read More Intentionally. So which is more important, writing intentionally or reading intentionally? It's kind of a chicken and egg question, but ultimately I believe intentional media consumption is more important. Why? Because the personalized landscape of our individual media consumption is the fertile ground out of which grows everything we might hope to create. Someone who chooses media with the utmost intention is unlikely to then create without intention. And even if they did, I have to believe the careful attention to input would still favorably impact the output. In short, we are what we read and watch. No doubt you're familiar with the suggestion that you are the average of the 5 people you're around the most. Your media consumption impacts you just as greatly. It's worth examining 5 of the shows you watch most often and 5 of the series you most like to read, or perhaps for simplicity's sake, the type of shows and books you most enjoy, and considering how they have made you, for better or worse. You could also think of it like this. Your writing is unlikely to rise above the average quality or thematic messaging of what you read and watch. More crucially, consuming low-quality media risks the dulling of yourself. And if nothing else, even if the effect is neutral, you must contend with the fact that in not asking more of your media, and therefore of yourself, you are missing potential opportunities to raise yourself. Intentional media consumption affects everyone, but as writers, our interaction with media has the potential to create a greater ripple effect. Not only do our media choices affect us personally, which of course necessarily affects our writing, they also directly shape our own works of fiction. The single greatest rule of thumb when it comes to questioning whether you're reading and watching critically is to consider whether or not you are reading or watching with your soul. And fundamentally, what I mean by this is that engagement should bring a certain spark of aliveness. What you read or watch should make you feel alive. Media is nourishment for our minds and souls. Just as with the physical nourishment of food, we have to consider whether we're getting enough quality nutrients. Are we consuming junk content or real content? Just as with junk food, it's true enough that we all tend toward a soft spot for junk entertainment. And what is junk entertainment? I'd say it's empty calories that are satisfying but not satisfying, adds nothing of real value, possibly leaches valuable nutrients, that is time, happiness, contentment, positivity, and is strangely but inarguably addictive. Now, this isn't to say the occasional cheat day isn't a worthy part of our lives, but a steady diet of anything that isn't actively adding value is at best a waste, and at worst actively harmful to both ourselves, our potential readers, and inevitably the collective. We tend to blame much of our current dissatisfaction with modern media on the fact that storytelling has become ever more polarizing and political. It is not uncommon for the release of even the most popcorny of all entertainment, the summer blockbuster, to be bulldozed by political rants of all persuasions. It can be difficult to engage with modern media without guarding against intrusive messaging, and that may even be before we know what the messaging may be. Many people cry out that stories should not be vehicles for political and social agendas and should get back to being just for fun or just entertainment. But maybe you already know what I think about the just word in front of stories. Now, I do not believe this is the problem. Stories have always been political. By their very nature, as an inherently transformational experience, they can't really be anything else. Never mind that the simple act of reporting on the human condition is also inherently and often dangerously political. Neither is the problem that real stories and important stories shouldn't be fun. Indeed, I can't help but think that the most wildly entertaining genre stories are those with the most potential for impacting humanity, not only through their sheer accessibility, but also through their natural tendency toward the simple depth of the archetypal experience. Now, in my opinion, what we are ultimately reacting against, and out of sheer exhaustion increasingly putting up with, are specific trends that have taken us away from the true heart, the true soul of what story really is. Problematic storytelling devices that we should be conscious of when consuming and should not excuse include plot-driven stories that neglect character arcs. That is, characters who are made to serve the plots rather than plots who are made to serve the characters. Entertainment-first storytelling versus artistic integrity. That is, seeking stories that will supposedly sell versus writing stories of originality and personal intensity. Flat stereotypes versus rich archetypes. That is, writing tropes and plot formulae versus meeting, understanding, and mining the deeper archetypal wisdom of story transformation. And finally, storytelling instead of story channeling. That is, creating stories primarily or entirely from our left brain's logic versus listening to what wants to come through the right brain. In many ways, I think reading and watching critically is actually more difficult than mindful storytelling. And partly this is because we often feel we have less control over what media is placed before us to consume versus what we can consciously choose to create. Mostly, however, it is because consumption is a relatively passive action. We simply sit and accept what we are given, even if we don't necessarily like it, whilst creation is necessarily demands our entire active participation and therefore choice. As such, and because watching and reading as a writer is such an intrinsic part of the larger storytelling process, upping the ante on media literacy for writers becomes a deeply important topic. So, to that end, here are several suggestions for nourishing your creative mind, all of them straight from my own practices in intentional media consumption. Tip number 1. Stop consuming content that doesn't spark curiosity. So, yes, the first step is to just stop watching and reading. If there's no spark, turn it off. Don't consume mindlessly just because it's there. Just say no. Although I have always had the habit of watching an hour or two of TV or movies in the evening, recently I decided to take an indefinite break for the simple reason that I was spending upwards of 2 hours every day watching stuff that, for the most part, I didn't even like. Now, part of this reaction is due to my own moods and tastes at the moment, but part of it is the very real scroll of doom on Netflix and other streaming services. By stepping away from habitual viewing, not only can I spare myself from increasingly unintentional media choices, I can also devote those 2 hours to more productive pursuits like reading a good book or working on my own writing. If a movie or show comes along that I'm actually excited about, Stranger Things 5, looking at you, I'll watch it. Until then, impress me. I'll wait. Tip number 2, make space for silence. Now, I have always felt, with no small degree of satisfaction, that watching movies and reading books was just part of my job. But amidst the ever-increasing cacophony that is my almost 40-year-old brain in the year of 2025, the need to step back and hear myself has become perhaps an even more important part of that job. As writers, we are, and I think should be, influenced by the media collective. But our stories ultimately come from us, and the only way to truly find them is to make sure we can hear our own inner whisperings louder than whatever junk food TV might be playing in the background. Tip number 3, practice reflective watching and reading. When you do read or watch, take the time to think critically about what you consume. So for a writer, this may begin by critically analyzing technique. As a 21st century human, this demands noticing where we might be copying to habitual and ingrained responses, either for or against. And perhaps most important, it should mean noticing how you feel. Questions to ask about intentional reading and watching include, how are the feelings that are coming up, whether big or small, for or against, happy or angry, how are they a mirror for you? What do you think the author wanted you to experience? And how did your actual experience line up with this? These are first and foremost soul work questions, but they are also questions about honing writing technique. Tip number 4, challenge yourself with unfamiliar stories. Reading with intention often means going off the beaten track. So instead of simply choosing the latest show available on streaming or the newest bestseller in your favorite genre, take your autonomy in your hands and make the commitment to be bold. Read things that are edgy. Edgy stories are those that push you because they require skillful comprehension. They ask you to step beyond what is triggering, confronting, or uncomfortable. They beckon from outside your current comfort zone or personal interests. They represent something strange, frightening, or seemingly other. And they scare you just a little bit. Tip number 5, revisit books and films that moved you. So return to some of your old favorites, those that spoke to your mind, heart, and soul. Sometimes I have to go back to the books and movies that made me want to be a writer in the first place, just to see if the old magic is still there. And it is. And it always gives me hope because it means story is still there. It's still alive on the page, on the screen, and in me. Story is just as vibrant and moving and exciting as it ever was, as long as we're looking in the right places. Tip number 6, create intentional reading challenges. A good reading or watching challenge is always a good way to mix things up and to make sure your choices are intentional and to explore story terrain you may otherwise have missed entirely. 3 of my ongoing challenges are reading the classics, which I define as any famous book written prior to 1980, reading the Pulitzer winners for fiction, and watching all the movies in my collection in reverse order starting in the 1930s. And here are a few more ideas for reading or watching challenges. Maybe read an author who challenges you, a genre you've never read, a book you know sits across from your current ideological fence rail, a movie from each decade, a foreign film, something you used to love and something you used to hate, just to see if anything has changed. The point is to detour from comfortable ruts and to rouse curiosity for the unknown. You never know what you'll find. Probably your next story idea. And tip number 7, read for true fun, not passive distraction. So finally, it's worth saying that intentional media consumption is not about forcing yourself to become a highbrow literary elitist, unless you want to be. Rather, I believe the single greatest sign that we're on the track with our reading and watching is that we are having fun, not mindless semi-satisfaction, but true heart-pounding, gut-clenching, laughing out loud, squealing in the theater, delighted, ignited, enlivened fun. Yes, story is indeed entertainment, but it is never just entertainment. It is engagement. True fun is never mindless because it shows us the core of our own passions and truths. So perhaps the best rule of all for reading and watching with intention is to ask, am I having fun? And if you're not, don't. If stories are nourishment, then writers are the cooks who must taste every ingredient before serving it up. What we take in becomes the flavor of what we offer the world. Choosing to read more intentionally is more than a personal practice. It's a creative responsibility. When we consume with care, curiosity, and courage, we elevate our own craft and influence the stories being told around us. The world doesn't need more noise. It needs storytellers who are listening first. If writers don't read and watch with intention, who will? So that brings us to the end of today's episode. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll stop by the site and comment on the post that is associated with this podcast. You can find a full transcript as well if you're interested. And talk to me about this. Do you think writers have a responsibility to read more intentionally? And if so, what's one story that changed the way you think about your own writing? And that brings us to the end of this episode of Helping Writers Become Authors. I hope you'll stop by the site for a full transcript of this episode and to join in the conversation in the comments. Tune in for next week's episode, where we'll continue to explore all things writing and storytelling. If you'd like to support the podcast, it always means a ton when you take a moment to leave a quick rating or review on Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, or Spotify. To stay updated on all the latest content I create for you, the best way is to join my mailing list at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/mailing list. You'll also immediately gain access to lots of free resources, including my books, Crafting Unforgettable Characters and 5 Secrets of Story Structure. For real-time connection with me, more writing advice, and behind-the-scenes glimpses, follow me on Instagram at authorkmwyland. A heartfelt thank you to each one of you for your support and enthusiasm, and especially those of you who support my work on patreon.com/kmwyland. You help make my site, this podcast, and so many other resources available to writers everywhere. So until next week, keep writing, keep dreaming, and most importantly, keep being true to your stories. Thank you for being part of Helping Writers Become Authors.